Instrumental conditioning theorists. We are like dwarfs sitting on the shoulders of giants. We see more and things that are more distant than they did, not because our sight is superior or because we are taller than they, but because they raise us up and by their great stature add to ours. This is a quote from the 12th century theologian and author John of Salisbury, and was recycled by Isaac Newton as he spoke to his rival, Robert Hooke, in 1676. It is basically a compliment and a praise-filled commentary on the fact that everyone learns from those who have gone before or spoken concerning the similar matter that they are now saying, thinking, writing, or testing. This presentation opens with this quote so that it might set the stage for the life and times of those theorists related to the early days of instrumental conditioning. And it will illustrate how the early researchers of instrumental conditioning used their contemporaries as valuable resources for developing the early theories of classical conditioning, instrumental operant conditioning, and behaviorism. Also included are a few details about the lives of 5 early researchers and how their early life experiences may have influenced their professional careers. Between the 1920s and 1950, behaviorism was a primary paradigm in psychology, and it was concerned with observable behavior as opposed to internal events like thinking and emotions. It seems that at the center of all behavioral actions and interactions are the ideas that conditioning creates changes in animal behavior, including the human animal, and that change leads to learning. Conditioning is defined as a behavioral process whereby a response becomes more predictable or frequent in a given environment or setting as a result of a reinforcement, with the reinforcement typically being a stimulus or reward for a desired response. Conditioning was studied by physiologists in Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, and these leaders at the time developed the procedures, observations, and definitions of conditioning. After the 1920s, psychologists turned their research from the work of the physiologists to research in the nature and prerequisites of conditioning. 2 important concepts central to behavioral psychology are classical and operant conditioning. Classical is sometimes referred to as Pavlovian, and operant is often referred to as instrumental. Both result in learning, but the processes are quite different. Classical conditioning was first described by Pavlov, and it involves placing a neutral signal before a reflex, while Skinner's instrumental conditioning involves reinforcement and punishment after a behavior. The focus of classical conditioning is involuntary automatic behavior. Instrumental conditioning focuses on strengthening or weakening voluntary behavior. Today, psychologists generally assume that learning occurs as a result of instrumental conditioning rather than classical conditioning. The remainder of this presentation will detail 5 noteworthy individuals who seem to epitomize instrumental conditioning, classical conditioning, and behaviorism: Ivan Pavlov, Edward Thorndike, John Watson, Jerzy Konorski, and B.F. Skinner. These physiologists and psychologists could be found figuratively sitting on the shoulders of giants from whom they learned and expanded their theories. The discussion will begin with the earliest born person. Ivan Pavlov was born in Russia on September 14, 1849. This was before Russia came under the Soviet regime. He was the son of a village priest and a stay-at-home mom. He got married at age 32 and over the years fathered 5 children. Pavlov died in 1936. Pavlov could read at age 7, but around that time he was injured when he fell from a high wall onto the stone pavement, so he did not resume his formal education until age 11. Later, he left the local theological seminary to attend the University of St. Petersburg, where he received a doctorate in veterinary physiology. After receiving his doctorate, he moved to Germany and conducted research on the digestive tract of dogs. In 1901, Pavlov published his concept concerning conditional reflex, when, upon the ringing of a bell and having food dust blown in their faces, dogs would salivate. Pavlov also used whistles, electric shock, metronomes, tuning forks, and a range of visual stimuli to get the conditioned reflex from the dogs in the lab. Pavlov's idea of conditioned reflex was seen as an automatic form of learning and became a key concept in the developing specialism of comparative psychology and the general approach to behavioral psychology. Pavlov's writing finally became popular after the research and documents written by John B. Watson. One of Pavlov's dogs is even preserved at the Pavlov Museum in Russia. E. L. Thorndike, whose father was a Methodist minister, was born on August 31, 1874, in Lowell, Massachusetts. He was married in 1900, fathered 5 children, and died in 1949. He studied instrumental conditioning, working with cats and their behavior as they tried to escape from puzzle boxes. The puzzle boxes had a pulley-weighted door attached to a string. When the cats pulled a lever or pressed a bar, the door would open. Thorndike observed that at first the cats took a long time to get out, but with more practice their escape took less time. They learned which response was successful, allowing for a faster escape. Thorndike's law of effect theorized that behaviors followed by satisfying consequences tend to be repeated, while behaviors resulting in non-satisfying consequences decrease. Thorndike worked with the U.S. Army during World War I, developing the military's aptitude test known as the ASVAB, which is still used today. He created 2 versions, the Alpha for those who could read and the Beta for those who could not. Another interesting concept from Thorndike deals with humans' ability to learn. The human ability to learn begins its decline around the age of 35, and roughly at a rate of 1% per year. This seems to go against the old saying that you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Today, it seems that the speed of learning, not the power of learning, declines with age. So, old dogs can learn, just at a slower pace. Thorndike was also the first to introduce the concept of reinforcement and the first to apply the principles of psychology to areas of learning. John Watson was born in Greenville, South Carolina on January 9, 1878. He was born to an extremely religious Baptist mother who named him after a prominent Baptist preacher, hoping that he would follow in the preacher's footsteps when he grew up. However, he learned to hate all religions. Watson's mother allowed no drinking, dancing, nor smoking at home, so his alcoholic father left the family, eventually moving in with 2 Indian women. He got married, but had an affair with his graduate student assistant, Rosalie Rayner, which resulted in his divorce. He later married Rosalie. He died in 1958. Watson entered Furman University at the age of 16 and got his master's degree at the age of 21. In the early 20th century, a new movement became a big part of psychology and was being felt in educational research. This new movement came to be called behaviorism. Watson has been called the father of behaviorism, which was partially based on Pavlov's work on stimulus response by animals. He became very interested in Pavlov and included a very simplified version of Pavlov's principles in his own writings. One comment from Watson regards human behavior as having to do with a chain of well-set reflexes affected by recency and frequency. Although Watson admired and respected the work of Pavlov, he rejected Thorndike's law of effect. This was a precursor to B.F. Skinner's principle of reinforcement, which he also rejected. John and Rosalie were responsible for frightening little Albert, a young orphan boy, in the Little Albert experiment. In short, the Little Albert experiment was a case study showing evidence of classical conditioning in humans. Albert, a 9-month-old, was shown a variety of items, including a white rat. He played with the rat and was not afraid of any of the items at first. Later, when Albert touched the rat, Watson and Rayner made loud noises behind his back. When he heard the noises, Albert cried, showing fear. This pairing of the 2 stimuli, the rat and the loud noises, occurred several times. In future trials, when Albert was presented with only the rat, without the loud noises, he became quite distressed and was now afraid of the rat. Apparently, Albert associated the rat with the impending loud noises, which scared him, producing the emotional response of crying. This showed that learning had occurred. Albert anticipated that loud noises would accompany the appearance of the rat, so he no longer liked it. Watson later went into advertising and wrote commercials. He is credited with being the first to say "coffee break" when he wrote for Maxwell House Coffee. Jerzy Konorski was born in Łódź, Poland on December 1, 1903. His writings occurred during World War II and were rejected by Stalin. He was married to fellow neurophysiologist Liliana Lubinska and died in 1973. The Department of Neurophysiology at the Nenke Institute of Experimental Biology in Warsaw, Poland was created just for him, but was destroyed in the beginning days of the invasion of Poland in 1939. Yerza failed to reach England for freedom, but he did make it to the Soviet Union, where he was appointed to the primate lab on the Black Sea. But the lab had to be moved because of the German invasion. Konorski worked with Pavlov for 2 years after writing Pavlov a letter explaining his work. Pavlov is said to have believed that Konorski's Type 2 conditioning, which he called instrumental conditioning, was the same as Pavlov's Type 1 conditioning. Konorski is credited with further developing Pavlov's work, discovering secondary conditioned reflexes and instrumental conditioning. Controversy developed between Konorski and Skinner when Skinner called instrumental operant conditioning Type 1 and Pavlovian classical conditioning Type 2. Konorski is known to be the first to systematically investigate the mechanisms that are the basis for instrumental conditioning. B.F. Skinner was born in Susquehanna, Pennsylvania on March 20, 1904. After some controversy with a Christian teacher, he became an atheist. Skinner named his research field radical behaviorism. He was married and had 2 daughters. His wife and children were all by his side when he died in 1990. Skinner modeled his experiments after the works and experiments of Konorski. While enrolled at Harvard, Skinner hoped to turn the study of behavior into an experimental science. He constructed Skinner boxes, also called operant conditioning chambers, which used rats and pigeons during the experiments. These boxes had a lever for rats and a disc for pigeons. A press by the animal on these so-called manipulandum delivered food. Lights and tones were used for the good, while electric shocks were used for the punishments. During Skinner's dark years after he left his research, he went home to his parents and read John B. Watson's Behaviorism, which led him to graduate school to study psychology, after which he developed his own behaviorism. Skinner is revered for using scientific methods and approaches to the study of behavior, which many researchers thought was needed. On the other hand, he is often criticized because he tried to apply his findings about animals and their behavior during experiments to human behavior in real-life settings. Takeaways. The years from Pavlov's birth in 1849 to the death of Skinner in 1990 were a very rich and impressive 141 years for the study of behaviorism around the globe. No matter if the sharing of information and knowledge was congenial or not, they each learned from others in the field of instrumental conditioning theory. The personal lives of the 5 may have been difficult at times, but their professional lives seemed to be very fulfilling. Pavlov, Thorndike, Watson, Konorski, and Skinner, no matter the title of their individual areas or research in conditioning, definitely followed the footsteps laid down by their contemporaries. Each theorist built on the research and knowledge of the others. The view from the shoulders of the giant for these 5 dwarfs must have been very rewarding.